Hi, Terry. Hi,
How are you?
Luis.
Hi,
Nice to
Louisa.
see you.
Hi. Hi. Yeah, glad to see you too.
Great.
Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. For those who may be visiting, not registered for the course, my name's Terry Tucker. I'm one of the co-organizers for this seminar series, along with Louise Buck and Ed Mabaya. And today it's my privilege to introduce Louise Buck, not only a co-conspirator for this overall series, but today's presenter. Louise has worked for many decades in international conservation and development. Her early work on agroforestry and rural development was based in Kenya, where she was really a pioneer in bridging research and extension through a couple organizations. One was at that time called ICRAF, International Center for Agroforestry Research, now called World Agroforestry. And CARE, the NGO CARE. And then between 1994 and 2003, she was a senior scientist with CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, but she was based at Cornell. And then since 2004, Louise has been affiliated with Eco Agriculture Partners, a Washington-based organization where she leads programs related to collaborative management of integrated livestock, of integrated landscapes, I'm sorry. And so Louise has really, been one of these people at Cornell that bridges the academy and practice and works with a lot of leading organizations in research and outreach and capacity strengthening. She's based in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell, and in that department for a long time, she's worked on facilitation of multi-stakeholder innovation to strengthen systems of natural resource management that integrate ecological conservation, agricultural production, livelihood security, and institutional capacity development goals. And she specializes in designing and testing analytical frameworks and instructional resources that stimulate social learning. One of the things that I've really appreciated about Louise is the opportunities that she's created over many years for our students, both undergraduate and graduate students, to also engage with these partners and to engage in real world on the ground applied research. Today's talk is about some work that she's done recently in Ecuador. We're really pleased that I see on the Zoom call right now, Luisa Trujillo, who's a Cornell Humphrey Fellow alumnus, and Luis is Ecuadorian collaborator. So Luisa, we're really pleased to have you here. And I think Louise may mention that as well. So Louise received her PhD from Cornell, MS from Colorado State, and her two double bachelor's degrees, BA and BS, from the University of Colorado. So Louise, thanks so much for your seminar today.
Thank you, Terry, and it's a real pleasure to be able to give this seminar, and it's a special pleasure that Luisa Trujillo is in the audience, so to speak. She was a co-researcher and co-author of the paper that is related to this presentation, and she's also sort of one of the key implementers of one of the case studies here. So it's just great to have Louisa here with us, and if I say anything that doesn't make sense or that's wrong, I invite her to correct me, but maybe after it's over. Okay, so
Yeah.
what I'd like to do is present some key concepts to begin with, and then talk about the purpose and the method of this study that I'm presenting. And then we'll go through the 2 case studies of agroforestry and integrated landscape management in Ecuador. Briefly talk about, the factors that we use to analyze the results, a couple of discussion questions and conclusions. So, agroforestry. Many definitions of agroforestry, enormous amounts of time and effort have been spent in defining agroforestry, but ultimately, most simply, it's the cultivation and use of trees and shrubs with crops and livestock in agricultural systems. So that's one of the key concepts that we're using throughout this paper. Agroforestry is widely considered to have what's sometimes referred to as transformative potential to meet a whole range of, I'll say, sustainable development goals and local goals as well that embody both conservation and livelihood security kinds of objectives. Most recently, agroforestry is getting an enormous amount of attention as a strategy for mitigating and adapting to climate change, through the so-called land sectors. Over time, since I started working in the field of agroforestry as it was first kind of being invented as a new science and field of practice, even though it had actually been practiced for millennium, its popularity has been aligned with a variety of different kinds of intervention strategies or development and conservation goals. Climate change is a big one now. When it first started, it was really about biodiversity conservation. Now, food system development and agroecologically sound food system practices allies itself with agroforestry because it's a very broad-based land use system that has both demonstrated and proven conservation and development benefits. Agroforestry, despite its potential, has really been plagued, I would say, by factors, by a relative lack of adoption of agroforestry practices by land users, primarily farmers, compared with what's widely considered its potential. So this is just a listing of the kinds of factors that limit adoption that I've taken from a number of sources. It's not the whole list. But in general, there are 3 kind of strategies that are used to try to facilitate adoption. And a lot of it has to do with, in targeting and improving extension delivery systems, improving agroforestry technology to improve productivity and other performance goals, and developing markets for agroforestry, mainly focused at the farm and local community scale. Recent research on related to a few concepts that I'm going to introduce here have started to open the door for looking at factors affecting agroforestry adoption from a different sort of perspective and at a different scale. And these key concepts are what I've summarized as knowledge-intensive production and innovation, complex adaptive collaborative management, and value chain dynamics. And taken together, these 3 arenas of practice and research, which all originate in systems thinking around sustainable approaches to development. They combine to enable sort of a reframing of the discourse on scaling to reveal ways that farmer engagement, social learning, and related forms of social agency build institutional support and begin to transform challenges into opportunities. So they have to do with the idea that we don't just sort of wait for things to happen when we're doing sustainable development. We become agents of sustainable development. And in so doing, through these sort of different domains that are very interrelated, we can begin to, through the relationships that we develop with others and through, co-learning and through negotiation and, trying to jointly realize, common goals, we can actually change the outcomes of development trajectories rather than just waiting for certain factors to come together. So integrated landscape management is the second key concept that I would like to focus on today. And ILM links agriculture, forestry, and other land uses within a particular geography and provides multiple benefits that agroforestry promises to deliver. It can help reduce trade-offs between development and conservation goals. It can create new synergies, and it has a critical role to play in realizing the transformative potential of agroforestry. That's the basic premise of our study. That's our assertion that if we can operationalize this concept of integrated landscape management around the goal of trying to scale up agroforestry, that we can accelerate agroforestry adoption and strengthen the potential for agroforestry to actually not just be adopted, but to be adapted and to be practiced on a very wide scale. So we use ILM as an umbrella term for a whole range of related terms that use landscape management to address different objectives and provide multiple benefits. And the concept of a socio-ecological landscape is at the root of integrated landscape management. That is, landscapes are not just physical constructs, and they don't serve simply conservation goals, which originally the field of landscape management originated in the conservation arena. And it was widely considered to be sort of a forest and a wildlife management strategy. But over time, this idea of socio-ecological landscapes has arisen and been embraced across a wide variety of organizations. So that's the founding concept of ILM. I'm not sure why this doesn't advance. There, thank you. So there's 5 key elements of integrated landscape management. These elements have been derived over several years of consultation among organizations that research organizations and practitioner-oriented organizations, development organizations that have come together in various configurations over time and looked at a whole range. We actually have 90 different communities of practice that we examined that all have something in common with ILM to sort of distill what we consider these key elements of ILM. So this work has been codified in a number of publications. The most memorable, if you wanted to look it up, and the easiest to access, is called the Little Sustainable Landscapes book, which was published in 2015. And it basically brought together a whole 6 or 7 organizations that had been working in this growing field of ILM. And we kind of consolidated our thinking and distilled these key elements. So I'm not going to read them to you, but you will see these elements described when I go through the case studies, because they become the framework for examining the potential for agroforestry and ILM to work together in the 2 case study landscapes. Operationalizing those elements of integrated landscape management is pursued through an adaptive collaborative management process. Any of you who listened to Carol Culfer's seminar 2 weeks ago will recall the term adaptive collaborative management. She talked about that in the context of benefits from forest management. So this cycle of the ILM planning process is a sort of an operationalization of ILM or of ACM, and the 5 steps, you know, interact and intersect, and it's not linear, but it's to recognize that you need to spend time in each of these steps, and you have to bring all the different stakeholders together in each of the steps. It's not an expert-driven model. It's very much a collaborative, knowledge sharing and co-planning type of approach. So the purpose of our study was to explore the application of integrated landscape management strategies in agroforestry initiatives in the 2 large landscapes in Ecuador, and evaluate the contributions of ILM to their synergistic effects in scaling agroforestry. And we expected that ILM would improve on conventional linear adoption models that focus on extension, improved technology, and connecting products with existing markets. The method that we used involved first conducting a course. It was a 2-semester course on the concept of agroforestry landscapes. So we brought together primarily MPS students, Masters of Professional Studies students. We had a couple of PhD students in the group for both semesters, or one for both semesters, one for just one of the semesters. And for a while we had some undergraduates join us. And we spent 2 semesters exploring, you know, what is agroforestry, what is ILM, how can they be operationalized in different contexts that all the students came from, and you know, basically synthesized what we hypothesized to be linkages between these 2 concepts. We then took what we call a historical reconstruction approach to preparing the case studies. The case studies were prepared primarily by 2 of the participants in this class, and Louisa was one of them. And on the far left in this photo, you see Jeff Meacham, who was another. And so he stayed with the course the entire time, and we interacted as a group to basically reflect and comment on his experience as an agroforestry leader in the field, and on Louisa's experience as an agroforestry leader in the field. So the 2 cases we refer to as the Ecuadorian Amazon case and the Ecuadorian Andes case. So now what I'm going to do is go through each case individually and show what some of the key characteristics and linkages between the ILM elements, as we call them, are, and the contribution of those different elements to scaling agroforestry in these 2 initiatives. I'll begin and just show one slide on each initiative that gives sort of an overview of what the initiative was about. So the Agenda for Transforming Production in the Amazon, also known as ACPA, was a government-led agroforestry initiative that began in 2015. And it sought to work in 6 provinces over about 1 million hectares to overcome land degradation and deforestation, and to convert grasslands to sustainable agro-production systems through 5 types of agroforestry. And its target area was just over 300,000 hectares. So the next few slides are going to, the top of the slide will identify one of the ILM elements, and in the order in which I presented them to start with. And then we'll summarize what the APTA strategy for operationalizing that element was, and then what its contribution to scaling agroforestry has been so far. So the APTA strategy for Element 1, shared or negotiated landscape goals that are built on knowledge and interests of diverse stakeholders in the landscape. It involved multiple government units agreeing on conservation, sustainable production, commercialization through new supply chains, and that they hypothesized that that would address deforestation and overcome deforestation, which was the biggest contributor to the to forest in the Amazon becoming grassland. And its contribution to scaling agroforestry was that political, financial, institutional support for land management that specifies agroforestry is mobilized in the landscape. So it's bringing together different forms of institutional support, political, financial, and institutional, so that there's agreement at a high level on the basic overall goals. The second ILM element is the multi-sector collaboration and community engagement in decision-making and action. So in APTA, multiple ministries and indigenous groups collaborated for the first time at national and local levels. And that contributed to scaling agroforestry through coordination platforms that generated local buy-in for agroforestry promotion and adoption. The third ILM element, land and resource management practices, are designed to confer environmental, economic, and social benefits across the landscape. So this is the intervention strategies that affect land use, or the land use approaches. And in APTA, they were promoting silvopasture, shade, cacao and coffee, native fruits, fungi, fibers, and oils to provide income for producers and to protect ecosystem services. And its contribution to scaling was that technical assistance services were revised to promote diverse practices that appealed to different farmers. This was a particularly important element in terms of how it was operationalized in ATPA, that spatial arrangements and management of landscape features promote synergies among land uses and the flow of goods and ecosystem services across the landscape. ATPA had a very innovative farm to landscape level spatial planning approach, and they developed a GIS tool to help engage farmers and extension workers in developing plans that would include natural forest and riparian protection, as well as protective tree cover. So being able to visualize on the landscape, where to locate strategic agroforestry practices to complement existing forest land uses and existing cropping systems and so on, had an enormous effect on mobilizing people across the landscape to participate in this work. And so the contribution to scaling was that diverse agroforestry systems were matched with farm priorities and conditions to be profitable and adaptable while restoring soils and vegetative connectivity. It was the farmer and community level engagement in these spatial plans that really helped mobilize a new understanding of the role that agroforestry had to play in conservation and development. This is just a blow up of the farm landscape spatial planning tools, so you get an idea of the scope of that. These are generally about 10 acre parcels that were planned for, and the people, including Louisa, that were implementing the APTA project set at a high level, and they could strategically target these 10 acre assemblages and which farmers they needed to work with in which order in order to start having cumulative impacts across the landscape as different agroforestry practices came into play. The next ILM element that had played a role in ATPA was policies and markets are shaped to achieve diverse set of landscape objectives. So in ATPA, the promotion of innovative certification systems and branding is generating market demand for native fruits, seeds, oils, and wood, as well as for carbon. And the contribution to scaling is that viable markets for products and services incentivize farmers to adopt sustainable agroforestry systems. The difference here between this ILM element and conventional marketing is that they were very interested in promoting market development and market innovations like certification schemes and branding. They didn't just look for markets that were already there because there weren't any. They were very creative in creating new market opportunities, and still are. I shouldn't use the past tense. This is very much an ongoing process. And part of that was cultivating national and international markets for Amazonian products. So evidence of impact from all of this, all of these activities working together. So the target of ATPA was to convert, like I said, about 300,000 hectares by December 2022. And by the time we did this analysis, which was, we actually finished our analysis by the end of 2019, but we gathered this data from ATPA after they took it in mid-2019, so that it already reached more than half their goal. And of target of 15,000 households, over 9,000 had adopted agroforestry by mid-19, so that was more than half already. And ATPA's efforts accounted for 70 new product certifications and 12 new value chains by mid-2019. So if you compare those kinds of results to what you often get in a conventional agroforestry project, adoption rates are much, much higher than normal. Normally you get 10, 15, 20% adoption, those kinds of figures. So here they are getting half of their targets met in way less than half the time of the project. Now I'm going to turn to the second case. This is the Chaco Andean Biocorridor. So this is promoting forest and agricultural revival in the Andes Chaco region. This initiative, unlike ATPA, which was government-led, this one was led by local community organizations who managed to reach out and link up with international organizations over a 15 to 20 year period, so over a fairly long time period compared to the ATPA project, which had only started in 2015. So the goals here were to restore connectivity and biodiversity and livelihood security. The focus was in 3 counties across 2 provinces. The aim was to affect about 100,000 hectares, and 50,000 were targeted for sustainable production through agroforestry. The other 50,000 were for other types of forest land uses and or grassland management, but not agroforestry specifically. So I'll do the same thing, but this time instead of reading to you the ILM element, since you're more familiar with them now, I'll just shortcut it and say that the Andes Biocorridor strategy involved the Ministry of Environment, the municipality of Quito, the International Biosphere Reserve, agreed that agroforestry could anchor a community-based bioeconomy and national corridor approach. And they began to generate this vision as long ago as 2012. So the contribution to scaling was that national, municipal, and international organizations recognized the key role for agroforestry in meeting these multiple objectives. In the Andes, grassroots organizations organized to build municipal and regional alliances that included multiple knowledge partners. So again, the government itself was not as important here as civil society was in moving this agenda ahead. And civil society was very effective in engaging local universities that played a central role in the planning and designing and managing and promoting agroforestry. The universities they engaged designed community engaged studies that focused on guiding strategic investment. So they picked their studies and their study locations specifically to help generate the evidence that would mobilize key actors that they saw as essential to get involved in the behind what they'd already done and to develop alliances with new organizations. And they focused a lot on enterprise development in the context of the so-called regenerative economy, green economy. Those kinds of concepts were used to frame a lot of the studies. In terms of the land use practices, in the biocorridor, a lot of use was made of promoting polycultures and aquaculture systems to provide income and to connect ecosystem components. So they were using agroforestry strategically to build connectivity in highly fragmented landscapes while generating income. And this is just a quick snapshot of the kinds of practices that are used, and they're promoting in regenerative sustainable use areas. A lot of use of polycultures, home gardens, and so on. Much effort made to try to develop silvopasture systems, but silvopasture has been exceptionally difficult to promote and to get the kind of adoption that they're really striving for. There's many reasons why silvopasture is so difficult. We won't go into those now. But I'll just say in general that the theory is that as multi-strata home gardens and polycultures and more familiar agroforestry systems gain prominence and more people are practicing them, including cattle owners and people who practice livestock production, the idea is that the idea of silvopasture practices will continue to be improved. There's also 2 or 3 key policy constraints that are widely recognized to be limiting silvopasture adoption, so there's a lot of effort now in trying to lift those policy constraints. Another really important, particularly important intervention strategy in the Andes was using these community engaged studies to target particular localities. So agroforestry would progress to a certain point, and then there would be an area, a region, where it had not been so prominent. So they catalyzed people who were working in areas where agroforestry was becoming prominent to go, mobilize people in adjacent areas. And we're not talking here about just, a few extension workers doing this work. We're talking about mobilizing large community meetings and, trying to generate a broad base of interest and optimally, choosing the right kinds of practices for the right kinds of locations, recognizing that, through agroforestry design, you can tailor the interventions to the needs of particular places. In the Andes, a bioeconomy-based tourism approach and agriculture, the kind of agriculture that supports it, that is agroecological approaches to agriculture primarily, are considered a plausible, negotiable alternative strategy to mining, which is increasingly contentious land use in this area. It's certainly a competing land use with this vision of a green economy, a bioeconomy. It's considered very threatening, and a lot of work went into analyzing opportunities for, not in our study, but in the case study that underlies this. For the last 10 years, the actors in the Andes Biocorridor study have worked on trying to demonstrate how agroforestry's role in a bioeconomy can be a substitute for mining. They're having a hard time with that. But they're hoping to link it and have been linking it with tourism. Up until recently, the tourism industry in this area have been growing in leaps and bounds. Hopefully it will again. And so they're linking the two, agroforestry and agroecotourism is what we call it, are seen to be able to, at least provide a plausible alternative to mining in the area. Here, the evidence of impact is that about 3,600 hectares of agroforestry and community forestry have been established with about 2,000 farmers. There is some silvopasture in a few farms, but not enough. In one particular area where the threat of mining was particularly significant and where a lot of concerted effort went into developing alternatives to that livelihood or that economic strategy, they had a relatively high uptake. And in another area where watershed management efforts were were very successful, partly because of interest in protecting water sources, downstream users being willing to work on payments for ecosystem services for upstream users. That contributed to changing land use to more of an agroforestry type of approach in order to protect the watersheds. So we are finding that that whole landscape strategies have engaged sectors that were not previously focused on agroforestry by demonstrating how it could advance other sectoral objectives beyond farm production and income. The ability to reach scale is by mobilizing institutional and financial resources from multiple sectors and integrating agroforestry into broader economic development and environment strategies. As I highlighted when I went through, in each case, different elements of ILM were particularly strategic and helping to scale. In the APA, the element of the spatial planning was particularly strategic. It really had a big impact on mobilizing different actors to understand what was going on and what their different roles were. I think the visualization and the spatialization of that planning tool were very impactful. And on the biocorridor, the engagement with local universities and doing strategic studies that pinpointed, exactly where to target interventions were particularly effective. That said, it's really all the elements working together that help to scale agroforestry. You need the collaboration, you need the spatial perspective, you need the cost sharing, you need stakeholder engaged problem solving, you need businesses engaged in helping generate opportunities for developing new product supply chains. And when you get all these actors together and they develop enough interest in solving their respective problems, with the aid of agroforestry, some of the sort of overarching constraints that are often cited to doing any of this kind of work, conservation and development work, can start to become addressed. And land tenure security, of course, is among the biggest recognized obstacles to agroforestry practice and the practice of other types of regenerative systems. And so lots of negotiation going on around tenure in both of these cases. And what I recognized was that tenure security conventional rules can be relaxed and are relaxed in the context of trying to develop new development opportunities. In other words, it may be a zoning rule that would not allow certain kinds of land uses officially, legally. But when a wide variety of actors that have a common interest in this type of development come together, and they can say, well, let's go in on this together and design a tenure system that works for us, and then thereby try to affect policy. So more of an incremental approach to changing tenure than we sometimes see, rather than assuming that we have to change it by legal decree. In conclusion, the Ecuadorian cases, we believe, demonstrate modalities and the potential for scaling agroforestry through ILM. The ILM framework aids agroforestry initiatives in designing and further defining and refining a coherent scaling strategy. It does not prove that ILM will help to scale agroforestry. It suggests ways that they can work together. And there's still a long ways to go in realizing the kinds of agroforestry practice, scaling and practice goals that each of these initiatives have. But each of them, at least as recognized through Louisa and Jeff, the authors of the case, both of whom, Jeff I didn't mention, had been an actor in the Chaco Biocorridor region for over 20 years, trying to promote agroforestry. when he got involved with us at Cornell. And by the time, as we were doing this study and as he recognized the roles that ILM were playing, he saw huge potential for accelerating the scaling. So it's not a done deal, but it's a nice shot in the arm in terms of how we might design, future strategies for promoting agroforestry. The cases and analysis still raise many questions. For example, how can agroforestry extension systems be better aligned with ILM? The extension systems themselves, often are doing things in more conventional ways than some of the pioneers that these two initiatives were able to capture and bring along with them. So how do we take conventional extension systems and link them up with this ILM approach so that there's a little more innovation going on in conventional extension? How can ILM tools be adapted and combined to upscale agroforestry? A lot of ILM tools out there that I haven't gone into, but there's ways of practicing ILM that may not be specific to agroforestry, but by looking at the two more deliberately in concert, we think there's potential for further accelerating agroforestry through ILM. And then the big question, of course, is how can long-term multi-source financing to support agroforestry landscapes be generated? Landscape finance, landscape investment and finance has become a cutting-edge focus and sort of theme of integrated landscape management field and practitioners. And we're starting to get some ideas about how we can be more innovative with keeping the finance flowing so that it's not project-based. The Chaco Biocorridor, Andes Chaco Biocorridor, recognized intermittent financing is their probably biggest obstacle for ongoing acceleration of agroforestry. Things were too incremental, and long periods of time would go by between grants and so on. So this is kind of a major focal area now. How do we generate the finance from sources in the landscape and from external investors who might have a opportunity to profit from land uses in the landscape, contribute to this kind of work. In conclusion, I want to acknowledge the many people who contributed to the study. The people I've named on the left here all were very active participants in the courses that we ran, the two back-to-back seminars that we ran, and in addition to the co-authors of the study, Louisa and Jeff. And then Professor Lasoy and Terry Tucker and Lori Leonard were instrumental in providing both technical support and financial support for doing the field work. I don't know if I mentioned, but I did go to the field with the class for 10 days to Ecuador between the two semesters, so that we could together examine some of these phenomena we've been talking about and actually kind of stimulate some thinking on the ground about what the practitioners doing agroforestry felt were contributors to the scaling that we were perceiving. And so the study was very much informed by the many farmers and many extension workers that we interviewed during that field trip. And so we think these leadership of Global Development, IPCAL's, Department of Natural Resources and Environment, and the School of Integrated Plant Science for enabling us to do the field work that was required, and for supporting the students here that made all of this possible. This study has been published in Sustainability Science just this year in 2020. It just came out recently. And so this is the citation for the study. And if any of you are interested in either agroforestry or sustainable landscape management, or how the two intersect, there's a whole special issue of Sustainability Science that I was one of the co-authors on, that brings together, I think it's 12 different papers that have to do with these topics. And these authors Most of them had come together at the World Agroforestry Congress in Montpellier in 2019. And it was through that work where I first presented the very beginnings of our findings from this study that this special issue came out. So for me, this is a really important signal that both of these domains of study and practice are getting attention now, and I hope become more prominent, and I hope become better funded. And they should become more of an arena for study and ongoing knowledge generation. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments. I'd like to begin, though, by asking Louisa just to say a word or two to the group. Louisa was absolutely instrumental in all of this happening, and I'm just thrilled that she's here with us today. So Louisa, hello.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. I am glad to be here. Thank you, Louise and Terry. Yeah, and I am happy to see how the ATPA project contributes for this article, and it is a good example for how the integrated landscape management to help to scaling up agroforestry. Yeah, and in Ecuador is the ATPA project is the first project that the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock developed to integrate all the elements, in this case, in the farms. Yeah, because the in general, the ministry work only focus on one crop, but not integrate all the elements of all the landscape. Yeah, and in that time, in the project, I was an agroforestry specialist. We work in 6 provinces of the Amazonian of Ecuador with small scale farmers. And the idea of the forest is to promote the conservation of the native species, because with the deforestation, the farmers cut the trees and plant or only pastures and no more. And the species are, in danger to disappear. Yeah. Another thing is that when I was part of the class with Louise and Louise Lasso, Jim Lasso, sorry, and with the group, I understand that we are implied integrated landscape management in our project. We don't know about this. Yeah, for us was a new term, but we are happy that we are doing this in Ecuador. Yeah, and it is, we are happy with the article because it promotes the ATPA project as a good example of ILM. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Louisa.
Thank you, Louisa, and thanks, Dr. Buck, very much for a really interesting and inspiring talk. And Louisa, it's so great to see you here. Participate in this. We have a few minutes for questions, so you can either, again, put them in the chat box. I'll try to monitor that as best I can, or raise your hand, and I will call them out and give Louise and or Louisa an opportunity to respond to those questions. Okay. Louise, maybe if you could stop the screen share, I'll be able to see more of the people at the same time. Okay, Michael Snow has a question. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned that in the second project, they used a payment for ecosystem services program. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what made it successful? And we're trying to do that at the state level in Vermont, and it's kind of wily. It's hard to get
It is wily. It was very experimental in this case. It was just we're just testing the potential. And but what it did is it brought people together who have a common interest in that. But yes, it was basically to support, it was the payers were residents of Quito, and they recognize that, so that's often what you need is a really strategic municipality that would otherwise have to pay a lot of money in order to clean up the water and make it. And so by paying land users to do things differently, they can offset their costs. So it was a very experimental effort. It didn't come to scale yet, but it offers potential for, recognizing the role of agroforestry. Jeff Meacham has details on exactly how far they got with that.
Can I follow up with that too a little bit?
Say that again?
Can I follow up?
Oh, try. Yeah, you can follow up. I don't know if I'll have enough information. I'm not super steeped in that particular piece of this.
That's okay. It's actually a little bit of a different part. A lot of stakeholders that you mentioned, right? And
yes,
it seems like there's a lot of opportunity for conflict, and I'm really curious about the process and what the meeting, how do you run a meeting like that, and how many meetings do you need? And
yes. Well, it's very, very meeting intensive, especially the Chaco Biocan, corridor thing, and the people who, I think the local universities that were engaged in that, they're mainly rural sociology types and people, very people-oriented scholars, and they're used to that. They do their work through meetings, and so I think that was just such an instrumental piece of all of this. But absolutely, it's very, very, the transaction costs in this approach are very high. There's no question about it.
Louise, there are two people with questions. First, I'll ask Louise Erskine to ask hers, and then following that, Jesse Hughes.
Hello, fellow Louise.
Hello, Louise. We got 3 Louises now.
It's a lot. You mentioned the historical reconstruction approach as a first step in your research. Can you just share a little bit more about what that is?
Yes. So it's basically looking, it's sort of 2 key components to it. One is looking at documents. This is to define the case studies. So we read a lot of documents about the history of land use in the area, about the development and history of the formation of this project. When we were together in country, we interviewed various people that Louisa had contacts with that were instrumental in initiating this project, what the thinking behind it was, and so on. And so what we were trying to do there is figure out to what extent ILM was embedded in the thinking and the design of the project, or because we didn't want to just assume that what we were seeing was had been in the minds of the constructors. So it's a combination of that, and then but the key element really is the reflective learning of the case study authors. So one of the reasons it was worthwhile to spend so much time in the 2 back-to-back seminars that we ran was it gave the case study authors, and actually we were going to include several other case studies in the study, but ultimately they didn't get as well developed and there wasn't space and all that. But we actually were evaluating in a similar way several other agroforestry initiatives by just asking a whole series of reflective questions of the practitioners in those cases. So Louisa had been there in APRA for many years, Jeff had been in the other one for many years, and by giving presentations on agroforestry, and the rest of us in the class critiquing them, by giving presentations on ILM and the co-authors critiquing them, we began to develop sort of a common understanding of what agroforestry and ILM meant in these particular contexts, in the context of the history of these projects and how they were designed, who was involved in designing them, and so on. It's a very actor-oriented approach. Who was thinking what when, but combined with some documentation.
Go ahead, Jesse. You're muted right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just flew out of my head. I'm gonna break the chain of Louise's. Thank you so much for the talk. I was really impressed with the scale of this project and how you had like very specific action points that you addressed like throughout the study. I'm really interested in the community perceptions of the project, like whether they thought something different was going to happen when all of these different levels of government and universities sort of converged on their communities to do this project, both projects.
Yeah.
Was there like, did individual people decide that they wanted to do different things and just sort of go off in different directions? Or like, did the communities as a whole want to take the project in a different direction than you initially anticipated? I had a lot of questions, sorry.
Yeah. The answer is it's just so variable. You know, we're working mainly with, especially in APA, with indigenous communities. And there's a very up and down kind of interaction between external projects and those communities. And when we were there, you know, I became aware of a number of sort of false starts, if you will, where extension workers would come in and give basically bad advice, things that the communities didn't really want, but the extension workers would insist upon them. And then they would do them, then they'd sort of regret it. And then other people would have to come in later and kind of fix it. So I can just imagine how they felt when they saw the next group of people coming. Some people are learning from that. They don't want the project to have that kind of impact on people. They're starting, I would say the most important influence we had during that study was we actually during our visit there was uncovering some of those kinds of things. And two of our team members, who I cited at the end and gave credit to, actually did their MPS studies on exactly those kinds of questions. And they actually came up with concrete recommendations for how to do extension differently that is much more consistent with the premises of ILM, which is all this, you know, social engagement and social learning, as opposed to what we call the conventional linear model, which is, I've got the technology, I've got the know-how, here's what you need to do. Whoops, sorry, that wasn't the right thing to do. Let's see if we can fix it. You know, so, yeah, so we call them sometimes clashing paradigms, and there's certainly clashing paradigms going on in this area, but hopefully over time, you know, and this more, what I call social learning approach will prevail because we know it's a much kinder, softer approach and effective.
I have one more follow-up question. What would you say community members were interested in initially versus what they were interested in at the end of the study? Like, were they initially interested in forestry practices and then they moved into like
I think Louisa has to
generating...
answer that one.
Okay.
Yeah, in our case, we started to socialize the project and invited of the communities, colonos and indigenous people, and invited to be part of the project by themselves. We are not forcing them to come to work with us. And the second, when they decided to work with us, our technician visit them in the farm, make a map, as you see in the presentation of Louise, yeah, a general map of the farm. And to start the work, we gave them incentive to, for example, seeds, tools, and to establish 1 hectare of agroforestry system. It depends on what they want, or it depends on the characteristics of the farm. Yeah. And when the farmers start their work, the neighbors see how they improve. For example, when we establish an agroforestry system, we establish crops for one perennial, but for crops for when you have the economy for 1 year, like corn or something like that. And they see that they can have for economy very fast, and then to establish, for example, cacao. Yeah. And it wasn't necessary that we call the farmers because they saw and they come to be part of the project in the ADPA project. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Terry?
Terry, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry. I said we've kept the two of you longer than we promised. However, if you have another 3 or 4 minutes, we have one more question from Rewa. And for those who have to go, we understand that we're already over time, and feel free to do so. Those that can stay, please feel free to do that as well. Rewa, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so mine is a really quick question. You mentioned in the beginning of the presentation that you sort of codified the elements of ILM through case studies of 90 communities.
19?
Oh, 19. Oh, I thought it was 90.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to ask you about that. Like, is ILM based in indigenous approaches? Like, is that where the inspiration comes from? And like, how do indigenous practices feature in like the whole framework of things?
Yeah. ILM does not originate as an indigenous concept. But ILM is actually, it's a construct that brings together practices, a whole range of different practices, some of which are, our recognition of them are from studying indigenous practices. And for me, it was thrilling to go to Ecuador, for example, and to see the indigenous practices that are iconic in the world of agroforestry. The textbooks and the studies that were written in the very early days of agroforestry are basically characterizing indigenous systems from the Amazon and from some other places, but the Amazon primarily, and saying, this is what we have to do more of. These are regenerative systems. And so how do we model these systems, and then how do we so-called, they talk about systematizing them and scientizing them and so on. But ultimately, those are the sources of inspiration for the whole field of agroforestry. And agroforestry is actually the source of inspiration, an important source of inspiration for integrated landscape management. So there's a very strong connection there, yes.
Was there a document that you were referring to that sort of has these case studies together, like that you spoke about in the beginning? I'm sorry, I may have missed it.
I don't have one particular document, but I can certainly provide several documents that would help you understand that if you're interested.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think, Louise, you maybe Ray was referring to the looking across the communities of practice, perhaps?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, I do have one document for that. I can put it in the chat. I mean, it's widely cited, and it actually it's a 4-page policy brief that identifies all those communities of practice that contribute. So yes, Terry, you can let me know the best way to get that to the students.
We can post it on Canvas.
Okay, I'll put that on Canvas, yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Louise. We really appreciate it. Great talk, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, bye. Hello.
Okay, we have, there are a few of us left here. I see Veronica is in Germany.